Foundation in Ithaca College. Our festival theme this year is entanglements, a concept that explores how different environments, ideas, imaginaries, places, politics, practices, registers, and species twist into each other in a mesh. We're all very honored that you've joined us today to celebrate the launch of Timothy Murray's exciting new book, Technics, Improvised, Activating Touch in Global Media Art. Please rename yourself with your physical location after your name. Our speakers will have a conversation, but it is with great pleasure that I now introduce Timothy Murray, author of Techniques, Improvised, director of the Cornell Council of the Arts, professor of comparative literature in English, and curator of the Rose Goldson Archive of New Media Art at Cornell University. Tim will be interviewed by Elizabeth Wijaya, assistant professor of East Asian cinema at the University of Toronto. But first, I want to introduce Dr. Patricia Zimmerman, Charles A. Dana Professor of Screen Studies at Ithaca College and director of FLEF. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. This evening requires a kind of different format than we do, and you'll see why in a minute. Thank you all for coming, and we welcome you to this FLEF space for Tim Murray to celebrate his book. For me, there is absolutely no greater pleasure in intellectual life than to celebrate the groundbreaking new book of a close friend, colleague, comrade, and in more ways than I can enumerate in public, a true brother. Tim Murray is one of the leading figures of film and new media theory, a curator whose projects have brought international artists to our region to jostle our minds, and a convener of counterpublics through his many symposia, luncheons, dinners, and other gatherings that bring together artists, theorists, writers, and thinkers. You can easily read the list of his many, many books and many curatorial projects in the chat. But what you cannot discover in his extended professional bio is his commitment to promoting and interrogating the important historical legacies of independent media, technology, and new media art in the upstate New York region, one of the most vital and vibrant areas in the United States for this kind of work with a very long history. His own work as a scholar, curator, and symposia convener has contributed to our region's vivacity and importance as a vital and critical epicenter of independent media practice and theory in the world. Tim is a community builder extraordinaire. For example, he has been a FLEFista for 20 years. Through his legendary pedagogy, which of course book launches like this often elide and erase, he has passed on the torch to the next generation of undergraduates and graduate students to ferociously theorize and passionately deconstruct media produced beyond corporate sectors, and to make space for it in their writing, their syllabi, their programming, their curatorial efforts, their speaking, their making, their conferences, and more. So I thought about how could I ever introduce my close friend Tim to those of you here on this Zoom who have not known him and collaborated him for 4 decades like I have, whether on land or on water. It is no easy task with a scholar and friend who has opened new worlds and new connections to so many of us on this Zoom tonight, with his generosity of spirit and his acuity of intellect. As I read Technics, Improvised, I was quite stunned, astonished, if you will, by the tour de force theorizations and the trenchant, eye-opening analysis of global media art. I was stunned by the realization that these exquisite elegant theorizations of sound, touch, the body, and media are not just virtuosic, coy wordplays with theory. These theories emanate from Tim's deep politics and ethics that the world at the moment requires new thinking and new action, that the old ways no longer work, and that we all need to join together to make new maps. I realized that if I made a list of keywords from Technics Improvised, you might then have a sense of the expansiveness and generosity of Tim's radical interventions and how he invites us to join the collective spirit he sees and argues as necessary and urgent to dismantle all that is ossified, stagnant, and corporate. These words all suggest movement and flow, a kind of intellectual and artistic battle against stasis. So here are the words, keywords from Technics Improvised that I hope will inspire you tonight. Folds, layers, process, improvisation, movement, touch, layers, incompossibilities, proximities, transformations, conjurings, transversals, torquing, elasticity, labyrinth, recombinations, open, disruptive, flow, process, mutation, the unexpected, relationality, and collectivity. Let me close this very personal introduction to Tim with two sentences I totally lifted from Technics Improvised. Touch, shake, disturb, and resist the closed. Elizabeth?
So I'm really glad to be here today, and it's always intellectually and artistically inspiring to be at FLEF. And of course, for today, this is a very special occasion, and I'm just completely agreeing with everything that Patty just said about Tim's book. And Tim has also been a great inspiration to my own work and thinking. So for today, the plan is that Tim will do a short 15-minute presentation on the book. We'll have a conversation for 20-25 minutes and followed by a Q&A. And for everyone present today, if you're able to, we ask that you come on camera and unmute yourself when you ask a question. So Tim, over to you for your presentation.
Wow. Hi, everybody. Just scrolling across the screen, it's kind of amazing. You've all showed up for this, and a lot of you are having breakfast, whether in Australia or Hong Kong or Korea, and some of you, a couple of you are in Europe, and you're just waiting to go to bed. So I hope not to keep you up too late. But first, just let me say how fantastic it is to be able to benefit from this gathering organized by FLEF. Thank you especially to Patty, who's put a lot of work into this and has been aided by Annie Michelle and Phil Wild, who are the producers who have done a really great job. Although Annie, I can see my fire alarm now, so I'll try to move my head. What I want to do is I'm going to just for a little bit, maybe 15 minutes, run through some common themes of the books, some of the things that I think are most important. And in so doing, I'm going to juxtapose those with a series of slides of images of artworks that I discuss in the book. I'm not always going to refer to them, but the pieces that I've selected frame some of the concepts that I'll be talking about. So let me just share my screen. And I think, yeah. So this is a book that's really been a long time in coming, and it's kind of been a process actually for about 10 or 12 years, come and go. I've written parts of it, then gone back to parts of it, reshaped everything finally for the book. And really it was a result of COVID that had happened. I was supposed to be curating the 2020 Cornell Biennial, or mounting this huge biennial in April through September of 2020. It got stopped, and And luckily, it just gave me time to finish this book. So it was fantastic. So what the book is really doing is it performs a tactical assemblage of the philosophy of touch and the work of media artists who boldly face the heightened politics of risk. The artworks and theory assembled in the book weave together to create improvisations of thinking techniques today that I understand as artistically affirmational, in contrast to the anesthetizing skepticism of many of my theoretical and curatorial colleagues who understand the allure of new media to reflect only the threatening taint of surveillance and digital neoliberal capital. The central question of the book is, how might a critical engagement with global media art, from video art of the 70s to digital performance of the present, complicate our theorization and our artistic experimentation of technospace and the political present of the neoliberal Anthropocene, which my former teacher Jacques Derrida imagined as tele-technological now over 30 years ago. And I think that this beautiful installation by John McComfer, that it was at the 2019 Venice Biennale, kind of testifies to the tensions around the Anthropocene that are felt globally. Technics Improvises learns from a 50-year range of global media works and philosophies of technology that directly face the aesthetics of process and the politics of risk. Its stake is a tactical theatrics that passionately activates against the hegemonic past, as in Maurice Benayoun's Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, while energetically compelling us to embrace the unstable imperatives of the political improvisations of media art. And I noticed that Maurice is here with us. So thanks for sharing your slide, Maurice. The curatorial and theoretical context of the book reflects how my history of teaching aesthetic philosophy while curating global media art has refined my sense of performance, of subjectivity, materiality, and archivization in the expansive environment of contemporary art and theory. And while my practice is influenced by my courses on aesthetics and philosophies of technology at Cornell, Peking University, and South Korea's Dongguk and Ewha Women's Universities, my intertwined commitment to art, philosophy, and politics has been refined conceptually by international collaborations over 3 decades with electronic artists, theorizations, and curators, many of whom are here, and it's just so wonderful to see you. A lot of this has happened via the past 2 decades of my curating the Rose Goldson Archive of New Media Art in the Cornell Library. And Mendy and Keith Obadike, for example, whose net art piece I screened in 2000, are actually going to be featured artists in the 2022 Cornell Biennial that I'm curating right now. As a combinatory of art, theory, and curating, the book activates media art's intertwined touch of tactics, thought, and politics, really to face the open abyss of the future, which is now doubly threatened by ecological and nuclear implosion. The art and theory it puts into dialogue shakes off the enclosures of ontology, commodity, and colony to orient the readers and participants in intertwined fictions of technics and performance. The book opens with an essay on risk in the improvisations of media art, thanks really to Vishnu Ghosh and Bhaskar Sakar, and I saw Bhaskar is on the call, that serves as a broad prolegomena to activating touch in global media art. Melding the political and the philosophical, as you can see, this is just a common theme of mine, where I constantly try to foreground the political, both in my curatorial and theoretical life, and also in my political life. As some of you might know, I'm actually an elected politician. The book addresses the threats to futurity posed by digital sovereignty and nuclear militarization, whose touch extends from the delights of gaming to the perils of the Anthropocene, and risks which are now obviously so very seriously made present by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all of the awfulness that is surrounding us. In contrast to this kind of depressing scenario, I really do argue for the promise of new media art in the very shadow of its peril by reading historical and contemporary artworks on war, ecology, race, archiving, and performance. Many of these works foreground the psychic time travel of trauma, which has been so important to my previous books, as well as the vicissitudes of digitality itself, since access to many of the book's artistic works of the 1990s and 2000s is now imperiled by the technical obsolescence of net art in CD-ROMs. So Suzanne Treister's No Other Symptoms, Time Traveling with Rosalind Brodsky, which is an amazingly creative piece, is virtually unavailable thanks to Apple switch to the Intel chip in 2002. Equally important is the combination of future cinema and future fever across the book. Is a rearticulation of political aesthetics away from the future, away from the utopian visions of the avant-gardes into the contemporary temporal swirl of untimely action by which different times and views of cyber worldliness communicate incompossibly. And this notion of the incompossible is something that I really developed in my last book, Digital Baroque, but it comes out of a combination of Leibniz and Gilles Deleuze as worlds that coexist, but in tension, but aren't in total contradiction. This whole notion of futurity also kind of dwells from an epigraph that I marshal a couple of times in the book from the famous baseball player Yogi Berra, who is famous for his aphorisms. And this is, "The future ain't what it used to be." So using this, how can we imagine staging an approach to media and threat in which the improvisations of fiction and fantasy, rather than reason or oncology, might lie at the core of critical responses to cataclysmic threat? How might we imagine otherwise the futurity of the world we might not want to inhabit? And maybe a good evidence of this is this beautiful still from Tejal Shah's Between the Waves, a 5-channel video work in which her character, who's dressed in discarded CD-ROMs and lies within the eco-technical detritus of South Asia. The book is also laced through intersecting pressure points that go throughout the book, and Patty mentioned some of them, but I think what I'll do just for the remainder of my remarks is touch on a few of them. Tactical tools, archival events, ecotechnic touch and worldliness, incorporeal and materiality, clones and genomics, and political digital performance. And I'll just expand on those a little bit. I might mention that exemplary of the work in this book is Out of Syncs, The Fourth Floor, which was a net art piece from 2006 that I commissioned for the British magazine Metamute. And I noticed that Miranda and Nora Newmark are here from Australia. And this is just a remarkable piece, and aghast because Adobe ditched Flash last year. We can't access it. So some of these pressure points, tactical tools. I have a long chapter that opens the book literally thinking about the tools of video and new media and how they then activated from theories of fantasy of the open to networked activism and tactical media that have foregrounded media challenges the considerations of gender, sexuality, race, and capital. And also important is my concept of archival events, which comes from a combination of the artists that I work with and also my own work as an archivist, where we think of the range of expansive resources, open archives, and the interactive touch of archiving in contrast to the notion of an archive as a dead archaeology that you search through to find the truth, generated really by what Foucault and Deleuze have called the service effectivity of discourse, where discourse doesn't stop, or Fanon Mbembe's notion of situated political thinking, all in relationship to archival events. And this is a big archival event that I'm showing you, which is Laurent Mignon's and Christa Sommero's Fly High, Time Flies. This was part of a series of LED lightworks that were on Hong Kong's highest tower that Maurice Benayoun, who's here with us, curated for 2 or 3 years in Hong Kong before it was stopped for political reasons. Then there's ecotouch and worldliness. The ecotouch, ecotechnie, is a concept that comes out of the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, who's very influential for this book. He distinguishes between technology, technologie, and ecotechnie or ecotechnics. Technology you can think of as the apparati of the globalization and the appropriative logic of capital that generates the sovereign logic of war, from single point perspective to the camera, to the radar, to the machineries of war. In contrast to that, Nancy wants to think about how we can operate in what he calls a double world disorder. Technology doesn't go away because it gets shifted into ecotechnie in relationship to our current moment that would prefer a worlding that etches out the spatiality of an openness to worldliness, not globalization, the recognition of the poetic touch and the plural political presence of the width of ecotechnics in differing populations. So many of the artworks that inform this book drive these notions and exemplify the notions. Equally important to the book is a debate around immateriality. So what's with immateriality? I think we all know that in the past 10 years, with the rise of object ontology and new materialism, that there's been a dismissal of immateriality as a coda for new media art. And I continue to go back to the immaterial. And in the book, I do it in 2 different ways. One is going all the way back to Yves Klein's Sorbonne lecture on immateriality in 1956 in relationship to the beginning of the Sputnik Wars. And also Jean-François Lyotard showed Les Immatériaux, the immaterials, that was at the Centre Pompidou in the mid-80s. And then also marshaling a kind of paradoxical concept that Foucault enumerated as exemplary of Gilles Deleuze, who he is writing on, called incorporeal materiality. The artworks in the book that I talk about stage such concepts as breaking the univocal foundation of creativity's subjectivity, and especially capital's mystical object. In relationship to this, we can think of clones, right? And we can think of the role of the bio and the digital in relationship to human body transformations in the past 30 years. So I have a chapter on clones in relationship to how bio and digital art responds to the Human Genome Project and neoliberal funding streams that plague all of our universities to raise questions about the social, moral, and ethical challenges posed by the capital of biotech, and in this context that was marshaled by Paul Vanuz's relative velocity inscription device, the legacy of eugenics. The body kind of closes with thoughts on performance, and the body is techne, from the political digital performance of enumerated by Gilles Deleuze in relationship to the Italian filmmaker and performer Carmelo Bene, all the way to still art, the feminist performances from Lynn Hirschman-Leeson and Joan Jonas to Viennese Matrix, and I should say Shuli Cheng, apologies Shuli, and a lot of thinking about race as technology is framed by Wendy Chun And in this case, a 1999 piece by Bill T. Jones and Arnie Zane, the beautiful choreographers, called Ghost Catching. You know, I closed the book not with the normal epilogue, but because the book was so invested in thinking about how we can marshal fictionality as a means of rethinking the closures of ontology. Fictionality is an epistemological opening to thinking the world differently. I close it with a suggestion for an exhibition called Future Fever, the exposition. And weirdly, I have this great opportunity. I'm now curating the Cornell Biennial around this very concept, futurity is uncertain, which is actually the title of the last chapter of the book. And I just want to show you slides of 4 pieces that I've lifted from this fictional exhibition and will be showing at Cornell this fall. One is Larissa Sansur and Soren Lind's incredible film, In Vitro, which was in the Venice Biennale in 2019, which is a almost apocalyptic account of the last surviving Palestinian who is living underground as a result of global warming, in dialogue with the only viable clone who's going to carry on this legacy. Moon Kyung-won and Jan Juno's incredible The Ways of Holding Space and Flying, a very, very similar concept. This also was in the Venice Biennale in 2015. The Korean Pavilion in the Venice Biennale is at the highest point of Venice. The conceit is global warming raises the waters. The only place left is that spot. And this one character remains alive in kind of a digital cocoon, living through literally an incorporated archival event. The Caribbean Film Collective, which is an Australian Aboriginal collective, did Mermaids Mirror Worlds, a similar narrative of Aboriginal longevity in the wake of ecological disaster wrought by global neoliberal corporations, and only the Aboriginal occupants of Australia had the physical and mental wherewithal to survive it. And finally, the artist Patricia Dominguez, Madre Drone, which shows a kind of combination of resistance from Peruvian and Bolivian demonstrators in relationship to the burning down of the rainforest and their talk back through lasers. So this is kind of a caption of a synopsis of the book that I tried to do in a very, very short presentation, but I hope that especially the visuals gives you a sense of the beautiful range of works that have informed my thinking, the creative verve of the artists, many of whom have joined us today. And I just think that we're also fortunate to be living in this environment right now that talks back against the horrors that are trying to oppress us. So maybe, Liz, I switch over to you. What are we doing?
Thank you so much, Tim. I want to pick up on what you just said on the creative verve of the artist. So in the preface, you write that it is no coincidence that I tend to be drawn to artists with such corporeal and vibrational impulses. And in the book, as you've shown us, you draw from Foucault, Derrida, Fanon, Nancy, Lyotard, Deleuze, Fred Moulton, Wendy Chun, and artists from across the world. You write about exhibitions from Venice to Singapore. And of course, you have your own curatorial practice. So there's in this book a very dazzling approach to the global media, and situated as provocations, I think, of the intersection between media studies and area studies. And your work disrupts so many forms of bounded thought, right, from the nation state to narrow periodization to disciplinary boundaries. So I wanted to start by asking, could you speak about this experience of being drawn to certain artists and philosophical work in your curatorial teaching and writing practice, and gathering them together as archival events?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, books like this are curated, and the works that we are drawn to usually speak to us in certain ways. I'm kind of a hybrid myself because I really was trained as a French philosopher. So many of the philosophers that I write about I've been with my entire intellectual life. And yet at the same time, I found that the global media world and those writing about it provide us with a different texture and a different perception of how we can think the world. I've always preferred to keep them together incompossibly, as I call it, because I think in very, very many ways they speak to each other. But it's extremely important to me that we keep the global conversation going, because the weakness of my training initially is in France, in Paris, in the metropole, in the cosmopolitan metropole, is precisely that the vision was delimited by that very, very worldview, even though these same people were writing against that worldview. So what we've been able to accomplish in the past 40 years, and a lot of it in my world, is because of technological interfaces, both in the art world, but then the amazing thing that happened when we were able to experience the internet. For my generation, it was just a marvel, a total marvel. One of the things that's done is it's challenged area and regional studies, which came out of the Cold War, as in many cases CIA narratives. It's at the same time forged alliances, both between artists and thinkers. It's just so interesting, for example, how vibrant the reception and talk back against many of my teachers is in Asia. The dialogue that I try to position in this book, which has tension and rough edges, I hope, is so important across the world. So it's a really interesting question. But of course, what I try not to do is, this book is not an encyclopedia. It's not, it doesn't claim to have broad coverage. It has series of pressure points, and the pressure points are both theoretical, but also particularly artistic. And I don't think you can have one without the other within this conceptual world in which we're living now.
So on kind of the thought of the global and pressure point, I'm thinking also about the variations of the refrain from Yogi Berra that you showed us just now, where you have in this book, the future in what it used to be, or the future won't be what it used to be, right? And from there, you draw out implications of risk, war, contested futurities. And you also cite at one point Derrida from No Apocalypse, Not Now. So in this unfortunate time when nuclear tensions are high again, so could you speak, and like in the epilogue, you have the 10 fictions that you talk about, and adding on to, and echoing some of Patty's keywords, right, on ecotechnics, speculation, fantasy, fiction, imagination, improvisation. So in this time of heightened risk and heightened risk to the thoughts of globality and futurities, could you say more about the necessity of this thinking time and improvisation and fiction?
I mean, that's such an interesting question, Liz, because so much of my work in my previous books has been on probably memory and trauma in the relationship with the past and the present. And really important to that, for example, was my mobilization quite frequently of the psychoanalytic notion of transference, which reshapes past desires, say, into an altered reality of the present narration that is said by Freud to then have bearing on the future. But I think we're now in a moment where we have to just think about the status of the future period per se. So we can't possibly think about it in the utopian sense of the historical avant-gardes, right? A lot of people want to, but I think the artists that I work with would discourage us from thinking about it in relationship to, say, the grand narratives of the 20th century, such as utopia, Christianity, Marxism, capitalism, all of which have fixed endpoints, right? And instead, the tactical media artists that I work with, I think, discourage us from being bound by teleological, let's say, tunnel vision, and instead they want us to think about future media per se. Future cinema is actually a term that was used in the 90s for new media art. But you can think of, for example, the use of artificial intelligence and interactive media, such as, let's say, David Rockaby's 2001 installation Enchant, where users are coming and invited to speak into microphones in series of computers. And over time, that builds a database that then speaks back to them. So there is no endpoint in the artwork. It's continually evolving and working. But in contrast to that, we have the usurpation of the future by techno-commerce and planned obsolescence. Just like I can't activate the huge collection of internet art that I have in the Goldson archive because of Adobe's abandonment of Flash. And this has been discussed, say, by Bernard Stiegler and Jean-Francois Lyotard and lots of people as in relationship to what they call the pull of the future, where the drive, our constant need to respond to planned obsolescence, rips us constantly away from the present into an empty future, right? And then there's Yogi Berra's "The Future Ain't What It Used to Be." And I mean, then I think of, say, electronic disturbance theater's juxtaposition between code switching and poetics to initiate an edge of the future in relationship to a combination of affect and effect, what Ricardo Domingos actually calls affect and effect. Or you can think of the history of Afrofuturism, which is having a really interesting resurgence right now. Or new queer and trans future migrations. There's also a huge feminist movement in Latin America. Patricia Domingos, whose slide I just showed, is exemplary of that. And then we can think about how the future opens the future now, not really in relationship to traumatic transference, but maybe improvisations, activations. Glissant talked about it as poetics of relation or accumulations of sediments, where the now is accumulating itself. I think that's what Nalsi meant by a ecotechnique, but not in relationship to a teleological promise, but a constant struggle to make things happen. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a really strong challenge that we're now facing. And so many artists are provoking us to think deeply about this.
It seems like in your book and also in your work on futurity is uncertain. As you say, there's this tension between like futures that have been usurped, and at one point you emphasize that it is also thinking about the futures that we do not want, or rather than arguing from the side of the futures that we want. So you seem to really place weight on holding the uncertain open. And one thing that I wanted to add in was one of the keywords, right, from your work, which is touch, right, activating touch. So this idea of like what has to be done, this in a way the action words, the activation, the improvisations, and this activating touch in relation to the surface. So keeping things that we have discussed in this short time in mind, right? This is the question of the global, keeping kind of the global precarity in view. Could you say more about this how not just how certain works activate touch, but how you see your writing as a form of activating touch?
I think that one of the things that a lot of us are trying to do is trying to engage work that to a certain degree flattens distance and distancing. So flattens the distance of perspective and flattens the distance of global hegemony and of colonialism that brings things in by keeping them away, right? And one of the ways of doing that is through proximity, which is very dangerous. It's very tricky. It's challenging. So it's not dangerous, it's challenging. And that means touch is proximity, it's intimacy. to some degree, it's affect. I tend not to dwell too much on affect theory because sometimes I think it's just not specific enough. But touch itself is electric, right? It's both opening up in relationship to human relations. It's connective, but it's also tense and it's tension, and there's a rub to it to a certain degree. And I think that's what a lot of contemporary media art is permitting us to do. They really do bring us very close into the screen, right up close, so that we're almost at this Alice in Wonderland flip moment. But they do it as a way of activating also against the technologies and the machineries of distance that prefer control and powerful distanciation, and also neoliberal capitalism to a certain extent. So that's one of the reasons that I'm drawn to philosophies of touch that I talk about in the book. And what's interesting is I mean, I was very much influenced by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, obviously, but equally by Frantz Fanon and Edouard Glissant, who bring the philosophy of touch into dynamic political tensions around colonialism, around cultural differentiation, and even around resistance, where touch is itself a political resistor via, let's say, tactical media.
I want to invite any of the attendees here today to unmute yourself if you want to have a conversation with us. Please join in our conversation if you have a question for Tim or a comment. So while people are still, you can raise your hand also to be unmuted. So while people are getting ready, I just wanted to comment, like, I think that is something that in your emphasis on incorporeality, immateriality, improvisation, and the vibrational, right? It's like almost, it seems like a rebellion, right, against what can be easily determined or easily grasped or easily solidified. And it seems that there is something in your and almost the event-based methodology that you have from your curation to in pre-COVID times, right? Going for different exhibitions around the world, that there's something going on about a certain rebellion against the determinations of what you just mentioned as neoliberal capitalism. So I wondered whether you could comment on this relationship to the fleeting or the almost gone, the thing that's not easy to hold on to.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the first chapter of the book actually talks about the drive against the object and against capitalization of early video art and early tactical new media art, and an attempt to break down the barriers of distance and profit that derived when art was commodified through the gallery system. And as a curator, I found that what I most benefit from is oftentimes what I'll do is I will come up with some kind of concept, but then I'll put out a call for work, and how I end up then finally articulating that concept is almost completely then driven by the work that comes in and how it interfaces with this. I mean, I can remember, I just saw Reggie Woolery on the screen, which is amazing. And Reggie was in the show that I did in 1999, Contact Zones, The Art of CD-ROM. And that was a similar thing where I just threw out a concept. Actually, it was the first probably internet show, because I put out a call over the Rhizome listserv. Nobody knew what it was. And I got 120 submissions in 2 weeks. But it was the work itself that ended up then making that show. And so it's this, literally the impact on curatorial thinking of the live artwork itself, that I think is so exemplary of our community, of our international community. As I look across the screen that's here, and I think of how so many of you from Connie Penley and Bhaskar and Vishnu and Santa Barbara to Maurice Benayoun in Hong Kong, the conversations that we've had have always been unstable. They've always been about uncertainty and a drive to articulate writing and artwork that encourages thinking and action, thinking and action. But the action itself is always somewhat uncertain because it is not utopically driven. It is driven out of necessity. And necessity is kind of open. And I don't know if that, I kind of lost track a little bit of the question, Liz, but I think that that's what's so interesting about the community that we have, which is a deeply engaged and vital and vibrant community. And so many of us who started working together 25, almost 30 years ago, are still working together in different ways, whether it's in Mark and Maria Miranda in Australia, or you know, who's from in your community in Singapore, which is both theoretical but deeply artistic. And there's something about that combination that keeps us honest, right? And keeps us thinking.
I think it's very beautiful in terms of what you said, that it is also the way you do your work, not just what you write about, right? That is part of this activation of touch, right? That and this bringing together of community. So we have a question from Jeanette Rodriguez. Would you like to be unmuted, right? From Ithaca.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, so
Hi.
you said, hi, I'm Jeanette. You said that you took like 10 to 12 years to complete the book and you finished most of it during COVID. Do you think that like COVID and that quarantine time changed the ideas of your book at all, or like changed the way that your book was headed?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think it changed the book, but it foregrounded the urgency of the issues that I discuss. The chapter that I have, the prevalence of the writing about risk, which really derived from a communal conversation that we had in Ithaca at the Society for the Humanities. I guess it was about 10 years ago. Has shifted so that one of the things that the pandemic has done is it's foregrounded the imperatives of thinking the global health system. It's foregrounded the vulnerability, the international vulnerability of economic disparity. It's foregrounded the speed at which the transmission of both ideas and danger flow through global circulation, right? It's foregrounded the digital is real here insofar as one of the things that I think we've learned internationally, we came to appreciate all the more so the disparities of communities who don't have high-speed internet access, learning communities of children who were sequestered at home for 2 years, whose learning was completely dictated by their economic means, vis-a-vis technology, right? And also the response of the art world, not against COVID, but against everything that seemed to be fighting against all of us during COVID, whether it's the educational institutions, the technological institutions, right? The health institutions. And at the same time, so many of us get our passion and our viability from being together, somewhat to the detriment, and that's paradoxical also, because we understand that it's to the detriment to the environment when we fly across the world to meet with each other. We've learned to supplement that much more through digital internet communication, although some of us have been doing this for 2 decades. But but for me, I mean, it was just the pause of time that allowed me to put together. I mean, I've been working on bits and parts of this for a long time, so it's allowed me to get. But I think what COVID did for me is foregrounded the imperative of thinking risk that I'd always been interested in and had written about. And risk not only in relation to the pandemic, but so many artists are working on the risks of the environment and the Anthropocene, and we have to see these things together. Does that help? Thank you for the question.
And we also have a digital hand up by Juliana.
Hello, thank you.
Hi.
Hi. In one of the previous LEF events, with some augmented reality artists, they were talking about sort of the irony between, this like risk at the environment of like using like iPhones and Apple technology in order to engage with their art, but also, trying to like share their work. And I was wondering if you could speak to that sort of like trying to like dismantle this like idea of neoliberal capitalism, but also like engaging with new media, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, one of the it's such an interesting challenge because discursively we've gone through many transformations. Initially in the early 1990s, it was the digital utopia, and these discourses were spurned by people like Bill Gates, who were using a kind of discourse of hope to build their global enterprises that now control us. And so many of the artists who had come out of the video world of kind of like pop-up video communities and tactical resistance shifted into the digital medium to do this work, but also have at the same time been doing more local activations. Ricardo Dominguez in the Electronic Disturbance Theater, for example, developed an app for a portable phone that could lead immigrants coming from Mexico into the US to water sources and water resources, an app for which he was almost arrested, even though it was just an artwork. And so that there are pockets of artists who are taking the advantages of digital technology and applying them locally. Bhaskar Sakar, who's on this call, has been doing an awful lot of work on pop-up modes of commerce, media commerce in South Asia, in which communities have basically withdrawn from the hegemonic umbrella of global capitalism and developed their own systems of commerce and exchange. And these are tensions that are just continuing. They're not new to digital technology. If you know the history of video art, it came out of a resistance to television and television flow and television commerce. So a lot of this is new. What's really dangerous now, and we have to try to somehow think our way out of it, is the dominance not of state-sponsored activity, but of global capitalist activity in rerouting a lot of our resources with extreme indifference to its impact.
So we have Bhaskar and Vishnu also.
Hey guys.
Hi Tim. Great to hear about the book finally. This is really, we both have questions, of course, so I'll be very brief.
I'm afraid.
But an amazing talk, and also Elizabeth drew out so many points that have already made me put questions out for me. Well, one of the things, when you were talking about the pandemic, is that in some ways we were always thinking about the future as a certain kind of rupture. And I think what the productivity of your book is, it gets us away from that imagination. When COVID-19 happened, the rupture is already here.
Yeah,
And then we look back on all these pandemics, and what we find is some things have remained the same. Certain populations have always paid a higher price, for instance. So I'm just wondering if you make us think of a way to find the future again, which is not after a rupture. This is just my hypothesis. I'm wondering what you would say about that. Instead, you've created a kind of a tunnel of sorts into future anteriors, the Bolivian activists looking at a burning forest, the 1950 lecture, Lynn Hirschman's work that can't be accessed anymore. I mean, there are many fragments that appear, and we're moving back and forth in this tunnel, which is a different kind of place from, something big happens, it's a sci-fi moment of a novum. It's not.
No.
So I wonder if you could, that's my question, is that if you want us to actually be in a different place in finding these futures.
I mean, that's not at all a challenging question. I just don't even think that we can be thinking futurity in a way that we did before, in a way that, I think of just something really practical that you mentioned, I remember how incredibly hopeful I was and turned on by the advantages of digital communication, right? And when Nora Newmark and I co-taught a course between the University of Technology in Sydney and Cornell University in 2000. It was an amazing thing that we were able to do that through a technology that is now, Zoom technology is now commonplace.
Yeah.
What we didn't and couldn't anticipate quite yet, and we were working on CD-ROMs and internet art, was how radically that could shift basically through the flip of an economic button. And 15 years of activist and creative digital art is now in stasis because of capitalist choices that were made by the large corporations who actually our community saved in the 1990s. Apple was on the verge of disintegrating. It was the multimedia community and the cinematic community that kept using their products. Adobe got its launch into the future through CD-ROM applications and Flash on the internet that they then were able to mobilize for broader corporate and business models. And for example, both of those corporations then just cut us off. And so now we're in the position of both trying to do new work, but somehow trying to save the old. Keep the old just accessible. And the old is 10 years old. We're not talking about a deep history. So I think similar things are going on in relationship to our struggle with the environment, we want to keep moving forward, but where the forward has been foreclosed by this pull of the future of digital obsolescence, really, and the same thing ecologically. So now what our future is now. It's really now, in terms of these kinds of pocket interventions that we try to make internationally in different communities. Apart from area studies. I've learned so much from you guys, especially. Bosker's entire thing on appropriation and recycling of little economic models that have empowered previously disempowered communities, which are totally off the grid in terms of this large global superstructure. That to me is futurity is uncertain.
So my question, Tim, is about the large grids, the overwhelmingly global, Zoom in particular. So I love it that at a point when we are facing maybe the Third World War and a pandemic that has brought the whole world to a standstill, you are asking us to move away from the traumatic or the traumatized modalities that have come about from the first two wars mainly, and be affirmative. I love it. But my question about Zoom is, given that we are right now in a community on Zoom, is this techniques improvised? It's very tough to think about a corporate platform that's devised for a corporate set of objectives, meetings, basically boardroom meetings and such, as improvised technique in any way, right? And yet it activates. It activates in many ways communities, as we know, right? We've had our cocktail hours over Zoom during COVID. So,
And they were marvelous.
yeah. So how do you like think about these two different trajectories together? I can give you a very concrete, great example of how it can be techniques improvised, but that will have to be an appropriation.
Well, I mean, I think Zoom is exemplary of the problem that we're talking about. I go back to when Nori and I taught this course together. There was no Zoom. There was a beginning of See You, See Me, which was this just really funky video chat kind of thing that didn't work. And she was teaching in the morning, I was teaching at night. And we discovered that we were losing our connection at about, it was about 8 o'clock in the evening, East Coast time. And the thing would get all funky. What we discovered in the middle of the class is that the reason that was happening is because the West Coast tech companies were doing their digital data dump to Asia at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, East Pacific time. And what we ended up doing was rerouting the entire class around that problem of disruption. And I think that that's Technics improvised. And I think that that's still happening. It's not happening through the Zoom platform, but it's happening in all of our different interventions, right? And I think it's really it's also now happening phantasmatically. For those of us my age, we're being taken back to our youth in a kind of retroactive callback to what didn't we not do right in relationship to the nuclear resistance? And how do we deal with the complacency of 3 decades, right, of media inactivity, media inactivity? Ooh, my camera's off. Renee just told me my camera was off. I wonder, this thing says the co-host has asked you to start your video. I had no idea what that meant. I thought, I'm not playing a video. But that's the problem that we're talking about.
So in the time we have, I wanted to ask Tim for some final words or final thoughts.
I'd just like to be able for all of us to get together in one space and talk some of this stuff out a little bit. And the challenge that we're now facing is that we're now still delimited by snippets of digital time around the organization of Zoom speak, right? And I think that's really holding us back again. And we're not able to do this interface of doing physical projects with conceptual and technical intervention. But that's really what I was trying to articulate in the book.
I see a digital hand up from Nori. I think we can have one.
Oh, that'd be great.
question
That'd
or
be
comment.
great. Hey,
Hi, Tim. Wow.
I was just talking about you.
I know. You know, I noticed in the chat, and I had the same feeling that, like, practically the instant you said disruption in response to the question about improvised, your camera went off.
And I had no idea.
And most of us thought, oh, performance, wow. Go, Tim. So, yeah, congratulations on the book. Very exciting. And, you know,
You're a big part of the book, you know.
Thanks to Patty and everyone for this event, and Liz for the, conversation. I just wanted to ask you to say a bit more about immateriality and, what there is about immateriality you sort of are interested in holding on to.
One of the notion of immateriality was one of the, I guess, the key words of the arrival of digital culture and digital discourse. And the failure of the term within that context is that it was marshaled in two ways. One, a kind of fantasy, the internet is a non-material kind of thing. Magic to a certain extent, right? But also, when that concept first got articulated, we didn't have multimedia internet yet either. And there was a lot of talk in relationship to identity formations vis-a-vis the internet, that it was liberating, that nobody was held back by their identity formation, that the immaterial gave you a kind of liberatory, almost utopian freedom. We almost came crashing down to earth very, very soon thereafter, of course, especially when we had multimedia and when people could then rely on the same interface to reclaim identities that had never been acknowledged, never had a place within this technological infrastructure, which really started with VNS Matrix to a certain extent in Australia, but then entire discourses of race, class, and exclusion. And then there was also the realization that the material aspect of digital culture, of course, is the generation of waste and detritus that we live with. But the other side of that I think still remains is the fictional verve. And I think of going back to Yves Klein, who gave this really remarkable lecture at the Sorbonne, and I think it was 1958. And he was talking about an art of air and an art of vapor and just being in the atmosphere. And there's something about thinking the horizon of the immaterials that resists or plays against, let's say, the subject-object distinction, or plays against the placement of the distancing of controlling technologies, or brings into play the miracles of fiction and fictionalizing. Or in your case, I think back to your work on smell and sound as vaporous interfaces, right? And Foucault did come up with this really interesting concept that he never really talked about, because he used it to figure Deleuze incorporeal materiality. And I'm interested in that, in that tension and combination. And that's why I want to keep the immaterial present. And it might not work, but I think it's necessary to try. Does that answer you?
Yeah, I think it's great, because I think, even though I'm into, say, new materialism, it can become too, like anything, too singular. So it's like you're keeping attention as you,
Yeah, that's really what I'm hoping to do.
Tension, paradox, whatever there. So materiality doesn't just, become too solidified.
Well, it becomes a new objectified ontology to a certain extent, and a new singularity, which is what I hope we need to keep resisting.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, it's so wonderful to see you.
So on these two words, keep resisting, right? I think there's something, even though for so much of this conversation, you've been warning us against commoditized forms of hope, right? Or utopic thinking. I can't help but think that there's really a fierce hope in what you're doing, right? Maybe a different kind of hope that remains, right, in your continued belief and emphasis. And as Vishnu and Bhaskar said, in these times of great tension and great danger to the global, right, in very embodied corporeal ways, you are reminding us that we need to still believe in the immaterial, right? To believe in the vaporous interfaces that can activate touch, to still kind of stay with the improvisational, the fantasy, the fictional, the speculation. So I think there's really something here. And also, despite what you just said, despite the necessity that it might not work. So really there's this very inspirational tension in the book and in this conversation about the future that's not what is going to be, the future that you do not allow to be utopic, but that you also refuse to let go of. So
yeah, so I just want to say one really quick thing. So there's a difference between hope and belief.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the screen and I'm seeing the wonderful Judy Kreidel, with whom decades ago I shared the belief of activism, not knowing at all what the result could possibly be. But it was the verve of the activism itself that mattered. And I think we're at this moment again. And I hope our students are.
And we're also right on time to pass the time back to Amy to announce the after party. So yes.
Oh yeah, the after party.
Yes, keeping with hope and belief. No, with the verve, yes, of belief. So thank you so much.
Well, yes, thank you so much, Elizabeth and Timmy, for a fantastic event. Wow, such a great crowd. And couple of things. There is a PDF in the chat, which you are welcome to download. It has all the lovely links, including the code for the discount for the book. We're going to have a little after party for about 15 minutes. But before we do that, everybody please unmute and let us give a nice round of applause for our fantastic presenters. Okay, and we'll